Welcome everyone to the District 4 Mobility Study Open House. I think we'll begin with an introduction by Supervisor Gordon Marr.
Great, thank you, Camille. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your weekend to join us for this virtual open house on the D4 Mobility Study. We commissioned this study in 2019 in order to better understand the transportation needs of our neighborhood. The connection between transit and the West Side goes deep. The building of the Twin Peaks Tunnel generations ago opened up the West to San Franciscans for the first time, and the development of our neighborhood, from sand dunes to the streets, homes, and businesses we know and love today, followed the development of the El Taravel and streetcar lines of yesteryear. And even now, the commercial corridors that are the cornerstone of the Sunset and Parkside are also our transit corridors, from the Parkside businesses along the El Taravel, the Noriega merchants along the 7 Noriega, and the Judah and Irving corridors connected by the single highest ridership line in the city, the N Judah. Since we started this study, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed much of how we live our lives and how we get around. Trips overall decreased as we sheltered in place and stayed home to save lives. And instead of commuting downtown, many of us have stayed closer to home, taking more trips within the Sunset. As rail service shut down, new programs were piloted, quickly adapting how streets are used during the pandemic to meet new and urgent needs for socially distanced recreation, for small business survival, and for safer trips on foot, bike, and with other mobility devices. Slow streets, shared spaces, and the transformation of the Great Highway have all had successes and real challenges. And as we move into and beyond the orange tier and more of our city opens for business and civic life, we are tasked with taking the lessons of these temporary changes and meeting the challenges moving forward. Though we commissioned this study prior to the pandemic, it has prepared us to step forward with a deeper understanding of new ideas and longstanding needs for how we can all get around conveniently, safely, and sustainably. We are approaching the 1-year anniversary of the transformation of a section of the Great Highway from a roadway for vehicles to a promenade for people. When a year ago, the Great Highway was closed due to sand on the roadway, as it often was, and I requested it remain that way during the public health order to accommodate socially distanced recreation and sustainable trips by walking and biking, we didn't know how long the pandemic would be with us. Today, we know that the promenade has been successful in its original goal, providing acres of new open space for thousands of people of every age and ability to safely recreate for physical and mental health, mental well-being every day. And we also know it has created very real challenges on traffic flow, congestion, and neighborhood connectivity by car. We worked with the SFMTA to launch the Outer Sunset Traffic Management Plan, bringing dozens of new traffic calming measures to the Outer Sunset. This traffic management strategy was necessary before COVID, before the change to the Great Highway. And while the traffic management plan was created as an urgent response to current conditions, the speed cushions and stop signs will provide permanent benefits and make our streets safer, regardless of what happens with the Great Highway. And we also expanded the D4 mobility study to analyze concepts for the future of the Great Highway and conducted a survey to hear from you. And Camille will present an update on what we've learned and heard so far. The reason we did this, the reason we need to plan for the future of the Great Highway with data, traffic modeling, and meaningful analysis isn't because of COVID-19 or the temporary change to the highway. It's because of climate change. As the sea levels rise, the city will no longer be able to safely maintain parts of this roadway. The recent collapse of parts of Highway 1 into the sea again near Big Sur is a stark reminder of this reality. The Great Highway extension south of Sloat to Skyline will be permanently closed to vehicles in the coming years through the Ocean Beach Climate Change Adaptation Project. And with that change, the utility of this road as a north-south through route will change. We didn't decide that, nature did. And with that change, we have to decide the best use of the rest of this part of the Great Highway from Lincoln to Sloat. These issues aren't new. The challenges of coastal erosion and the need to reimagine the use of the Great Highway were acknowledged and included in the Ocean Beach Master Plan. And the analysis and studies today builds on many, many years of important long-term work. What was new was our ability to try out a different use of the road during the pandemic, and we learned a lot about both its potential and the deep and serious challenges it creates. And we are quickly approaching a transition period, and how we move forward will be based on all the lessons we've learned, as well as the analysis the Transportation Authority has done and the data collected by SFMTA and Recon Park, and by all of you and your input. Of course, the Great Highway is only one component of the D4 mobility study, and I'm incredibly excited about many of the study's other findings for improving transit, connections to commercial corridors, and safety. Even with our history as a neighborhood deeply tied to transit, we are still largely dependent on cars to make trips in the Sunset. Through this study and through all of your input, we're working to make sure our transportation options are better meeting your needs, that we have more options and better options. That's our goal, better choices. And I'm grateful for all the work that has gone into this important study and for all of you taking part today. I do want to close by apologizing for not being able to stay for the entire open house this morning, as I need to attend an important community event about violence and discrimination against our Asian American community. Edward Wright from my office, who helped to plan today's event with the TA and who staffs me on transportation issues, will still be here. And I really do look forward to hearing about all of the input around these important issues that you'll be providing today. So thanks again, everyone, for being here. And maybe I'll turn it back over to Edward.
Thank you very much, Supervisor. We've got a lot of content to cover today, so we'll be quickly moving into the presentations on the different components of the Transportation Authority's D4 mobility study. So with that, I will in turn be turning it back to Camille Gariba with the Transportation Authority.
Thank you, Supervisor Mar, and thank you, Edward, for having us and inviting us to do this study. Again, I'm Camille Gariba, Senior Transportation Planner with the San Francisco County Transportation Authority and Project Manager for the District 4 Mobility Study. Before we get into the content, we want to start with a poll to understand where you're joining us from in the city, whether it's the Sunset, the Richmond, Park Merced, Stone Sound area, or West Portal, or elsewhere. And so, Edward, if you could please launch our first poll. Great. Thank you all for your quick participation in this poll. I see a lot of folks definitely from the Sunset joining us, which makes sense because of the content of our study, and even a good amount of folks from the Richmond and elsewhere in San Francisco. We'll keep that open a little bit longer, and I'll get into the agenda for the study, or for today's event. First, I'll briefly provide background on the study. Then we'll get into a large part of the content, which is an update on the evaluation of the Great Highway concepts we've been studying. This should take us to a little bit before 11 a.m. and then the rest of the meeting we'll get into the developing solutions for the mobility study, which include, as the supervisor mentioned, transit improvements to key commercial corridors, as well as a District 4 family neighborway network and safety improvements to Lincoln Way. And at the end of the meeting, we'll follow up with next steps. And because of the large amount of attendees in the meeting, we are having a number of these polls throughout the meeting, and throughout the meeting, you will be able to submit questions to my colleague, Hugh Lauch, and he'll be monitoring questions and comments and reporting those out periodically at different checkpoints. And so getting into the background of the study.
Camille, I think you need to share your screen.
Oh, I forgot to do that. Yes, thank you, Hugh. I was presenting without sharing it.
Yeah, it looks like the poll results keep popping up. Oh, there it goes.
Here we are. Sorry about that. Too many windows open. So again, just briefly going over the agenda, I'll briefly go over the background. We'll get into a long segment about the Great Highway evaluation, and then the developing solutions for the mobility study as a whole. And then again, wanted to really highlight the opportunities to send questions and comments to Hugh. He'll be monitoring those for us today and reporting out on what those are. And we'll also be saving that chat so that we can log those comments as part of our study and answer those questions after if we're not able to get to them during the meeting today. So jumping back to the overview of the study, as Supervisor Marr mentioned, he asked us to conduct this study to improve walking, biking, and transit in the Outer Sunset and Parkside neighborhoods as a means to improve health and safety, increase livability, and support a thriving local economy, as well as address climate change locally. At our first mobility study town hall in May, I presented data about how people were getting to, from, and within District 4 prior to the pandemic. In the data, it showed 76% of all District 4 associated trips were by car. And when looking at what those trips are, just even within the district, 65% were happening by car. We also found that a lot of those driving trips were happening nearby. The top 3 bars of this chart represent trips within D4 to the Richmond and Inner Sunset. Together, they account for 40,000 trips being taken by solar drivers in a day. We also see about 19,000 daily trips to San Mateo County. Many of these trips are dispersed, but we see some concentrations of destinations in the northern portions, such as Daly City, South San Francisco, Colma. And the solutions we have been developing for the study are focused on improving options for these shorter trip markets that we are able to try to address. Now getting into the first segment of our meeting, with the temporary car-free condition of the Great Highway during the pandemic, as the supervisor mentioned, he asked us to explore the alternatives for future use. And in November, we had a town hall where we presented 5 concepts. And since then, we've been working to evaluate those various options. As a reminder of the concepts, concept 1 is the 4-lane roadway, which the Great Highway is the Great Highway as we've known it in the past. Concept 2 has 1 vehicle lane per direction with a promenade in current southbound lanes. This is the idea that was originally in the Ocean Beach Master Plan from 2012, but this does require roadway construction to allow for the addition of a shoulder on each side of the roadway and an additional buffer between the 2 directions. Concept 3 is 4 lanes open for walking, biking, and other non-motorized use, and we've called this the full promenade option. For concept 4, we have called this the time promenade, and initially conceived this as being a full promenade on weekends and or on certain seasons, and then open to vehicles on the opposite times. We've since narrowed this concept to be weekends only, as we've observed as part of the temporary promenade that bicycle and pedestrian usage did not drop off necessarily by the season, and the factors that most impacted usage were the presence of smoke, wind, and rain. So there wasn't really a seasonality in the usage data that we've observed since September. Finally, concept 5 has the promenade in the current southbound lanes with 2 vehicles in one direction in the current northbound lanes. This is like concept 2 in that it's a combination roadway promenade concept, but with the one-way traffic, there's no need to completely reconstruct the roadway. Next, I'll get into the different factors we considered for the evaluations. We really were looking at a number of factors that relate to city policies, and these include climate change, resiliency, well-being, health, transit first, and the use of sustainable modes and mode choice, improving mode choices, equity, vision zero, and economic vitality. We also wanted, as part of the evaluation, to understand the costs of each concept and reviewed feedback on the concepts we received through the survey that was out in December into early January. Now, getting into the evaluation, starting with climate change and resilience. As the supervisor mentioned, the Ocean Beach Master Plan identified a need for managed retreat, including closing the Great Highway extension and reducing the use of the Great Highway over time. As the coastline recedes, it will be harder to maintain the Great Highway as a roadway, and repurposing all or part of the road as a park can be part of that managed retreat strategy. And we see that as a benefit of concepts that are able to add park acreage. So here we estimate that the full promenade would provide about 17 acres of new park space, with the time promenade providing that benefit only when in operation. And for the combination concepts, we estimate the additional park acreage to be about 6.7 acres. Additional park acreage also contributes to city recreation goals. Under the temporary promenade, about 6,000 bicyclists and pedestrians have used the roadway on weekend days and 4,000 on weekdays. And these counts are based on a counter that the Rec and Park Department has on the Upper Great Highway at the Judah intersection. And these were taken since mid-September. In addition to indicating which concepts best facilitate managed retreat from the beach, the additional park acreage is also an indicator of increased access to nature and recreation and health and well-being benefits. The additional benefit we measured was also the bike ped usage. In addition to being related to recreation, this evaluation factor is related to the city's transit first policy to encourage the use of sustainable modes. We estimate concept 3 to have a similar amount of visitors as the temporary promenade, equating to about 32,000 weekly visitors. And assuming similar weekend usage as the temporary promenade, we estimate about 12,000 weekly visitors for concept 4. And for the partial promenade roadway combinations, concepts 2 and 5, we considered the less space and having to cross 2 lanes of traffic to access it to mean fewer weekly visitors than the existing temporary promenade and thus the full promenade, and then even fewer visitors for the 4-lane roadway concept. Safety and achieving zero traffic deaths is another high priority for the city. We examined the number of collisions reports near Great Highway and District 4 overall. These represent any reported collision, whether it be between any modes, either 2 vehicles, vehicles and pedestrians, vehicles and bicyclists, and even bicyclists and pedestrians. District 4 is lucky to have low rates of traffic collisions in comparison to the rest of the city, while District 4 represents about 9% of the population. The collisions in the district are about 3% of total San Francisco collisions. On the Upper Great Highway and Lower Great Highway, including La Playa, there have been very few reported collisions before and even during the pandemic, about 5 to 6 per year. And during the pandemic, it stayed about the same. And what we do see is that looking at the collision rate for the district overall, there was a 47% decline during the pandemic. And while the data that we have for upper grade highway and lower grade highway is a small data set, it is important to flag that the upper grade highway and lower grade highway collisions remain the same while the D4 overall numbers trended down. This could be due to a number of factors, and as you all know, SFMTA is installing various mitigations under the temporary promenade, and as was planned prior to the pandemic, this warrants continued monitoring. For each of the concepts, we also evaluated the potential for multimodal conflicts based on the design. We identified concept 1 as high risk because pedestrians cross 4 vehicle lanes to access the beach, and cyclists currently share, under that condition, would share the road with vehicles. Under both concepts 2 and 5, risk is reduced for pedestrians as they are instead crossing only 2 vehicle lanes to access the beach. But concept 2 has the additional risk of head-on collision, vehicle-to-vehicle collisions because of the 2-way traffic design. We assess the full promenade at medium risk because while pedestrians would no longer experience conflicts with vehicles on the upper grade highway, there may be increased risk of collisions on residential streets if pass-through traffic is not diverted to the more major roadways. Finally, under the time promenade, pedestrians would still need to cross the 4 lanes on the weekdays, and there may be risk of collision if a driver is unaware of the road closure schedule. Next, we looked at vehicle traffic impacts, how well our streets are working and how easily people are able to get around impacts economic vitality. Vehicle traffic issues not only impact the drivers, but also people getting around on transit on those congested streets. For this part of the evaluation, we conducted modeling of the concepts under pre-pandemic traffic conditions and volumes. We also observed and heard from many of you about the traffic problems under the current temporary car-free Great Highway, and we've included these observed areas as part of the evaluation as well. On the next slides, I'll explain where we expect congestion and queuing of vehicles for all the concepts and major queuing, especially for concepts 3 and 4. So for concepts 1, even prior to the pandemic and the temporary promenade, there have been known issues at a couple intersections such as Lincoln and 41st, as well as Sloat and Skyline. The Great Highway extension is planned for closure because of the erosion that is happening on that stretch of roadway, and that means that vehicles in the future will need to pass through the Sloat and Skyline intersection in order to access the upper Great Highway. This is why even under concept 1, we expect there to be some queuing happening at the Sloat and Skyline intersection. We also expect few traffic issues with concept 5, the one-way roadway promenade, because many of the model traffic problems under the full promenade concept are related to the diversion of southbound traffic, as I will show in the next slide. When we modeled the complete vehicle closure, we found major queuing at Sloat and Skyline again, as well as southbound on Sunset approaching Sloat. And this is due to the configuration of how vehicles are accessing Sloat from Sunset through a series of stop signs. And under the temporary promenade, we've observed queuing and congestion at all the locations shown with a red dot. This includes a number of Lincoln Way intersections, as well as Chain of Lakes. And the same areas would be impacted under concept 2, the the two-way roadway, but the queuing is more expected to be moderate rather than major at Sloat and Skyline and Sunset and Sloat. And we also acknowledge that for the promenade options may contribute to traffic issues beyond District 4, such as south on Lake Merced Boulevard. As previously mentioned, vehicle congestion greatly impacts transit, and for that reason, the impacts we estimate for transit are based on the congested locations shown in the previous slide. So the 29 bus is especially impacted by the different promenade concepts because of the increased traffic expected on Sunset. There are also known existing delays on the 28 bus line that could be exacerbated by traffic being diverted to 19th Avenue. And so if unmitigated, we expect the worst transit impact under the full closure concept 3 and the timed promenade when in operation. And under concepts 2 to 5, there is also potential impact to the 18 bus line if traffic is not diverted away from the local residential streets. Finally, we identified for each concept the costs associated with the Great Highway itself and nearby transportation improvements. The capital costs includes changes to the roadway, the actual Great Highway roadway itself, traffic signal replacement, which is also already needed, intersection changes at Lincoln and Great Highway, as well as Sloat and Great Highway, traffic calming and diversion on neighborhood streets, which has already been happening. Concept 1, to keep the Great Highway as a roadway, still includes costs, as I mentioned, to replace the worn traffic signals, as well at intersection upgrades that are due. We see in concept 2 that, as I mentioned, requires reconstructing the roadway at a cost much higher than all the other concepts, at about $22.8 million. And concepts 2 and 5 also require upgrades at the Sloat intersection and the Lincoln intersection to match the new roadway alignments that would be under those concepts. Concepts 3 and 4 require costs to cover additional traffic calming and diversion measures to the adjacent streets. And then in addition, concept 4 notably has higher operating costs due to the need for SFMTA parking control officers to close and open the roadway each weekend. The concepts that resulted in more bike ped users require, for operating costs, require increased gardening, litter removal, restroom cleaning, and park ranger presence. And because of the increase of users, these costs scale with the estimated number of visitors. Based on the potential traffic and transit impacts, we expect additional costs beyond the immediate Great Highway project area. Some of these secondary costs are covered by existing projects. For example, improvements are already needed at the Sloat and Skyline intersections under any concept. And this is a project that SFMTA has been working on and could be influenced by whichever Great Highway concept advances. In addition, SFMTA is already planning for transit improvements to both the 29 and 28 bus lines. And so that's already ongoing efforts. But this is to show some potential secondary costs beyond what was shown in the previous slide. These secondary mitigation measures may include traffic signal timing and coordination, transit improvements, as mentioned, that increase frequency and prioritize transit on streets, and then intersection improvements or redesigns, as well as wayfinding signs and a shuttle, which is also part of our the ideas we're exploring for the overall District 4 mobility study. Now that we have a better understanding of the traffic issues under each concept, further work is needed to specify these secondary measures, mitigations, to help us understand the full cost of each of the concepts. Now I'll provide a summary of the results we received from the survey that was out in December. During our survey period, we received nearly 4,000 responses from various parts of San Francisco. So thank you all for participating in that survey. Of the total responses, about 95% were residents of San Francisco, and we had a number of other folks who were taking the survey from other parts of the region. And drilling down on the participants, 33% were residents of Sunset in the 2 Sunset zip codes that include the outer and even inner parts of the Sunset. And then we also had a good number of outer Richmond residents taking the survey at about 16%. As part of the survey, we asked residents about their priorities for the Upper Great Highway and the surrounding neighborhoods. The residents identified a variety of topics. The most common priority shown in the responses was bicycle and pedestrian access, then community benefit of recreation space, and then the third being vehicle access to the Great Highway, with bike and pedestrian safety and traffic management as other comments received, as well as roadway safety and climate adaptation. Survey participants were also asked which concept they preferred. Across all respondents, the full promenade was most identified as a preferred concept, followed by the 4-lane roadway at 21%. We recognize that these preferences can differ where you live, which is why we also looked at the information by the zip code that respondents provided, and have shown on the right how Sunset versus Outer Richmond residents responded. The Sunset response tracked with the overall responses, while we recognized that Outer Richmond residents were more flipped, more preferring the 4-lane roadway. Focusing on those 2 concepts that most survey respondents identified as their preferences, this is the feedback we've heard about those 2 concepts. The primary comments and concern about concept 1, the 4-lane roadway, were that it was seen as unsafe. Asking drivers to share the road with cyclists was an issue, and that there was a lot of room for cars under that concept. For concept 3, the full promenade, the main concerns were increased traffic in the area due to the closure, and as well as concern for safety and the need for traffic calming on surrounding streets. And so as the concept evaluation shows, there are major trade-offs between the impacts and benefits of various scenarios. We are recommending the elimination of concept 2 due to moderate benefit at high direct capital costs and some safety concerns. And the concepts 3 and 4 have benefits as shown, but there are those traffic impact and transit concerns, and we need to also estimate secondary costs to better understand that trade-off. We also need to continue to monitor traffic, the temporary promenade conditions as the economy reopens and congestion increases. And I will show on the next slide how others at the TA have been monitoring congestion during the pandemic. We have on our website a COVID congestion tracker, and we see that traffic has returned close to pre-COVID levels as of this month on Sunset, Lincoln, and Fulton. But looking at the delays for those vehicles in the map to the right, there are still few delays on those streets where traffic has returned. And as I mentioned SFMTA has been implementing traffic mitigation strategies and is monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of those strategies, including speeds and volumes, especially on the lower grade highway. As a reminder, the Recreation and Parks Department and SFMTA are the agencies who would implement an eventual project for the future of the Great Highway. And now I will pass it on to my colleague, Brian Stokel from the Rec and Park Department to speak more about the process as we hand off the evaluation that we've done to their departments.
Thank you, Camille. Thank you. I want to first thank for everybody for attending. It's really great to see so many people here. I also want to thank Supervisor Mars and his office for initiating this study, and especially to the Transportation Authority for all the work they've done and the collaboration with both Rec and Park and the MTA for putting together all of this analysis and presentation. It's really helpful, and I think it's helping us plan ahead. What's next? I think that's an important thing, and we need to present that. The next step is that we will be presenting the findings of this process of the Great Highway to a joint hearing of the Rec and Park Commission and the MTA Board sometime this late spring or early summer. And there we'll be providing direction to Rec and Park and the MTA staff on the next steps for the Great Highway. What that will include is there will be community feedback and a chance for people to comment on it at that time. Note the permanent change of the Great Highway will also have to require approval of the Board of Supervisors, and that also will have feedback from the community and a chance for people to comment. In the meantime, the Rec and Park, we've put together an email for feedback, so you have an easy way to get a hold of us for comments, questions, anyway, and that email is at the bottom of your screen. It's rec-greathighway@sfgov.org. That's rec-greathighway@sf.org. And I think that'll be a great way. We will also be, seeing that we don't have a date yet, we will be informing everybody of that date as soon as possible. And we want to get that arranged quickly. So that's it for me, and thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And now we will get to have a period of questions and comments on the evaluation. And if I can have you start telling me what questions and comments you're seeing in the chat.
Yeah, I will do. And I know a number of people have asked, why they can't see the chat. And we will be, publishing and sharing the full chat when we're complete with this. But just given the numbers of folks, it's necessary to manage it in this way. So I have a couple different questions, or quite a few questions that have come through from folks, but just to pick out a handful that are coming up multiple times. There were a couple questions about how the data, and this may be for Brian, how the data about people walking and biking on the promenade have been collected, and maybe just want to describe a little bit for folks how that was done and kind of what it represents.
Yeah, thanks. We have a sensor at the Great Highway, Upper Great Highway and Judah. It's called an eco counter. It basically senses when anybody goes past the sensor, and it does not separate by type of user. It's counting all people going by. So that's where the primary data is coming from, and we have had people go out there at a few times to spot check it, to correlate the data, so that data has been confirmed that what you see there is what we've been counting. So that's what we have right now.
Great, thanks, Brian. And maybe just indicate, and people are putting in this chat now as it goes. You know, that's a point on the Great Highway. Obviously, it's not everybody using it, walking and biking now, but it represents, you know, an estimate, you know, sort of a general sense of use.
Correct, and we realize that it may vary somewhat at different locations.
Quite a few questions about related to transit, you know, questions, and so maybe these are good ones for Tim to jump in on from an MTA perspective. You know, kind of questions about whether or not, you know, the lack of availability of transit during the pandemic has impacted how people get to the promenade and to the beach. Questions about whether or not the 18 is going to come back and when. But maybe, Tim, if you just want to kind of comment on some of the transit-related pieces of this.
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. Yeah, we recognize that our transit service has been significantly impacted during the pandemic, and much of our transit network has seen reduced level of usage as well. But at the same time, we are actively bringing back our transit service, and many folks who used to use the N will be pleased to know that we are planning to bring that service back, which will terminate right on the Great Highway this spring. We're actively making some really significant improvements and safety improvements to the L line as well. I think as we go into the next phase of this work, we definitely want to do a little bit more assessment of how folks are accessing and coming to this part of the city, and looking at the different you know, bike, ped, vehicle, transit, taxi, paratransit. Want to kind of have a better sense of that, and I think that's something we're interested in doing as we go forward. But we definitely, as I said earlier, are aware that transit service has been impacted throughout the whole city and throughout the whole region, and that we're actively trying to bring that service back online.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. There are a number of other questions here that kind of relate to how you know, the challenges that we face in terms of estimating some of these or answering some of these evaluation questions, because of the data that we can collect and the you know, the changes that we've experienced during the pandemic. So, you know, Camille and others, might be good just to sort of speak to those types of issues that we're seeing within this sort of overall evaluation framework. So people are asking, you know, were you able to collect data before the closure on some of these factors, you know, counts and safety and other things like that, and then how are we sort of taking into account you know, the sort of impact of you know, the pandemic on our estimates?
Yes, thanks for that question. I think I mentioned it briefly as part of explaining the traffic modeling that we did, and so the inputs to that traffic model that we did for the scenarios included a lot of inputs about the vehicle usage prior to the pandemic. And so we got in touch with different projects that had collected data in the area in 2019 and maybe the year before. So we have those numbers, and I think if you attended the November town hall, we shared some numbers about vehicle usage on the Great Highway from May 2019. And so we saw in those numbers that there were about 18 to almost 20,000 vehicles using the Great Highway on any given weekday or weekend prior to the pandemic, and that was May 2019 data. We also have data for those major streets that we really were focusing on, Sunset and 19th Avenue, and those were included as part of the inputs into our modeling.
Thanks, Camille. And then there are a couple questions related to, you know, I think you spoke a lot and we touched on a lot of topics within this, and there's much more detailed analysis for folks to dive into as we start to share some of the detailed findings. But, you know, there was questions about the traffic safety and the kind of traffic queuing that we discussed, and whether or not, you know, we've looked at what the impacts or implications of that are for people traveling by bike and foot, and in particular noting that, you know, areas like Lincoln have a long history of you know, safety concerns for people walking and biking along or trying to cross that road.
Yeah, so I think that's where the other solutions that we've been developing for the mobility study are trying to address the issues that we heard a lot during outreach last summer about kind of challenges and barriers to using walking, biking, and transit in the district. And so, yes, I hope you stay longer for the remainder of the session to hear the ideas we're exploring about the neighborway network, as well as safety improvements to Lincoln.
Great. And then I don't know, do we have time for one more?
Yeah, let's, I think we should be wrapping up this question and comment period.
I'll just
right
ask
now.
one, and I'll apologize to some folks who are quickly adding to the chat right now. It's a little hard for me to read, but we'll try to bring up some of your questions that are coming while I'm asking questions at our next break, if there are a couple that we sort of hear consistently. But there was a question earlier on about whether or not we've looked at for that option 5, right, which is sort of one direction, one-way traffic, and the other direction being a promenade, if we've looked at that being a sort of reversible lane. So 1 AM one direction and PM the other direction, for example.
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion. I think we focused on just understanding the impact of having the one way being southbound, as that is kind of the harder of the directions to divert traffic on the Great Highway. And so that's why we focus on the southbound direction. But I think there would be, just thinking off the top of my head, there would be operational challenges to kind of switching directions, similar to how the time promenade requires parking control officers to go out there and make the switch from promenade to not. For that time promenade, we'd have to employ a number of parking control officers to manage the switch of the direction every day. And so I think a concern with doing that would be operations costs. I know that that's something that I think in New York they've done. Is that right, Brian? I think we had heard about examples of that happening in other parts of the country. But yeah, there are operational challenges and costs associated with that.
Yeah, that's correct. In New York City, they did have, it was actually commuter time traffic going through Central Park, but it was only, they had to close and open it and had the same things you were saying about managing it.
And so thank you, Hugh, for conveying the questions and comments that we were able to get to. We are saving that chat and we'll be able to try to answer those questions. We have an FAQ document about the Great Highway on our website, and those were based on questions we received at the previous town hall and in emails, and we will look at the questions and comments that were logged in the chat to Hugh and try to answer those questions after the fact if we didn't get to them during the meeting. And now we will transition to the wider mobility study solutions that we've been developing for the study. I think the first we'll discuss are transit improvements. And so MTA, along with the Transportation Authority and the Planning Department, have been developing long-range planning concepts as part of the ConnectSF transit strategy. And there are a lot of ideas included in the transit strategy, and the ConnectSF team is launching a parallel outreach effort in the coming weeks. But I wanted to flag for the D4 mobility study a couple ideas that are relevant to the district. The first being a 5-minute network, which includes the 28 and 29 bus lines, as well as the N-Judah. The 5-minute network would provide fast, frequent service and easy transfers throughout San Francisco. But achieving the 5-minute network requires street improvements such as transit signal priority and lanes dedicated to buses. And so as part of the transit strategy that has been conceived through ConnectSF, the 5-minute network is complemented by routes at somewhat lower frequencies that will ensure service is provided across the city. A network of express routes, including prioritizing transit and other high occupancy vehicles on freeways in the city, as well as supporting paratransit service. So many of these changes can be put in place relatively quickly so that riders can see results sooner. The second piece about the transit strategy that I wanted to flag relevant to District 4 are some major new transit improvements to increase regional access by transit. And that involves a proposed subway along Geary and 19th Avenue. And so we wanted you to be aware of this citywide long-range planning effort that will be out in a couple of weeks. For the purposes of the District 4 mobility study, we are focusing on the 28 and the 29 5-minute service concept that is part of the ConnectSF transit strategy. And remembering some of the data I presented at the beginning of the meeting about how we are trying through the study to address improving options for folks who are driving very nearby and having other alternatives to that. And so we've taken the 28 and 29 with increased 5-minute service with a Peninsula Express bus service that we've conceived that would serve the Richmond, the Sunset, and the Northern Peninsula, including Daly City, Colma, and South San Francisco. And so, yeah, thinking back to the data I showed at the beginning about how there are a lot of trips between those areas just near to District 4, we tried to model what that transit service would look like together for the district. And we found that it would result in a 4.5% increase in transit trips for those trips that are happening to, from, and within District 4, as well as increase in riders on the 28 and the 29 that would have rapid service with that 5-minute frequency. And so considering the study's purpose to encourage more transit use, we have a few related poll questions. And as you answer those, you're also welcome to send questions and comments to Hugh about transit improvement thoughts. And so Hugh, do we have
why don't
any...
I just pick up a couple of the other questions that were kind of coming through the chat, and there's quite a lot of chat. I would note that we are getting a lot of comments from folks about the their preferences and the preferences of their neighbors and the issues that they're seeing. And we are recording all of this, as Camille said. We're going to save the chat. You'll be able to see all of it at the end of the day when we record all of it. We are getting a number of questions about thinking about whether or not we thought for the Great Highway in particular about whether or not that's creating sort of new demand, so more new travel of people coming to the Sunset to visit the facility because of it sort of serving as a bike ped promenade currently.
Yes, I think that's true that that there is kind of people coming from wherever they're coming from to visit the promenade, and I think that's telling as who took our survey. There being a number of San Mateo County residents took our survey, even East Bay, Alameda County residents took our survey. So I think there is a regional draw to the promenade, and part of that kind of trying to document what that usage is kind of the monitoring that we recommend continue to happen. And I think MTA is committed to doing. And so, as I mentioned, the SFMTA has been collecting periodic speed and volume data on the lower grade highway. And they've also kind of gone out and tried to survey parking issues. And if, Tim, you want to speak to some of those data collection pieces that you are doing as part of the traffic mitigation strategy that you've been working on.
Yeah, thanks, Camille. I mean, we definitely from MTA are going to be, we're in the middle of a construction project where we're installing a bunch of traffic calming devices. And as soon as that's in the ground, and we definitely appreciate the support from District 4 for that project. But as soon as that work is complete, we do plan to do a data collection survey, and we'll be looking throughout the network to better understand how effective that investment has been. And obviously, we're definitely relying upon the SFCTA's congestion tracker to give us a sense of how the whole network is coming back online. Because I think one thing we've realized is this is a pretty dynamic system, and we're in a very dynamic time. And from our perspective, we want to be closely monitoring and closely evaluating, and then making sure that our management approach maps to the very dynamic conditions that we're seeing evolving.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Tim. And I think you did mention at an earlier time about how, you are interested in further studying how people are getting to the promenade, and that's something of concern to MTA.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something of interest to us to as I mentioned earlier, understanding, and this is something Hugh brought up, how people are coming and what does that look like from a demand perspective, and making sure that we're managing that demand going forward.
Yeah, so another couple maybe transit specific questions that I'm seeing on here relate to, well, there's quite a few questions about, when service is going to be restored to some of the services, and there have been some recent announcements about that, and I think we can direct folks we can direct folks to the appropriate resources at MTA to follow, when the various rail lines are proposed to come back, when other reopening is proposed to happen. There's been a number of presentations about that recently. There's also been questions about wanting to understand better the cost and timing for some of the investments that Camille talked about, whether they're kind of specific to District 4 or some of the broader citywide strategies. So maybe just a quick comment on those would be good.
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. And as Hugh mentioned, there have been a number of presentations about what the recovery looks like for transportation. If you go to our website, sfcta.org, our last board meeting that happened on March 23rd, this past Tuesday, covered that, and you can download that presentation and materials about MTA's report on when different transit service will return in the city. And I think, for the mobility study, we are looking at a range of short and medium term strategies. I think some of the ConnectSF stuff, like the subway that was mentioned, that's definitely a long-term strategy, which is why for the mobility study, we are really focusing on the bus improvements that can happen in the next 5 to 10 years if we work quickly and advance our priorities sooner. So I think that's the time frame we're really focusing on for the study, is what can we do in the near and medium term next 10 years for the district to improve options. Other questions or comments you want to flag, Hugh?
Let's see, a lot of comments are coming in, a lot of questions. I know there's quite a few folks asking for a lot more specifics about individual routes that we're just not going to be able to cover today. And again, there are many, many efforts going on at MTA and broadly within the city to look at particular improvements that have been mentioned today. And we can certainly flag resources for folks, and you're welcome to get in touch with us to get more specific answers. If you have questions about a particular route, or get in touch with MTA if you have questions about a particular route that you'd like to understand better. But yeah, I think those are, we probably need to move on to the next segment. Oh, there's one question that actually maybe sets up a future segment here that I think was worth flagging, which is questions about as we look at kind of school reopening and the return of school, kids to school. Are we looking at how kids can walk and bike safely to schools and strategies to support that?
Great. Yeah, I think that is very directly related to the neighborway network concept that I'll present in, not in this next section, but the section after. So we'll get to that. So moving on to our next solution set. As part of the outreach, we also, last summer, we heard about challenges to access commercial corridors in District 4 by walking, biking, and transit from other parts of the district. And so in this section, I'll present ideas, a couple of ideas to improve access to commercial corridors, as well as safety in those commercial corridors for people using the walking, biking, and transit modes. The first being trying to provide an alternative to driving and improve access to commercial corridors. As I mentioned earlier, about 65% of trips happening within District 4 are happening by car. And so we're exploring the idea of a community shuttle to provide short distance rides in the districts and other nearby destinations. This can help fill transit gaps or help get people to major transit connections and other locations. And so other neighborhoods in the city have been developing potential community shuttles. We see our colleagues working on projects for Treasure Island, as well as the Bayview Hunters Point. And for Treasure Island, they've been exploring whether to do on-demand service or a fixed route service. I think there's different trade-offs to these types of services. And I think one of the things that we've learned from the work that they've done is that it might be that an on-demand service works when starting the service out and demand is lower, and transitioning to a fixed route when it's more clear what the demand of that service is. And the other thing that we've learned from other processes working on community shuttles are that oftentimes there are grants available for startup or pilot phases, but it is more difficult to fund ongoing operations of a community shuttle. And so those are some of the things we're thinking about as we are exploring this idea and how it could serve the neighborhood and fill in gaps and provide increased access for these short District 4 trips. We also heard from folks in the outreach about double parking issues in the commercial corridors, and double parking can present safety issues for bicyclists and pedestrians, as well as cause delay on those streets for people on transit as well as drivers. Looking at data about double parking citations, we see that in a lot of the in District 4, there's a few blocks, mostly in the inner, more commercial districts, that see a high number of these double parking citations and incidences. And so MTA is considering a new curbside loading zone to address the double parking issue. These proposed zones are intended for very short-term 5-minute loading on blocks that have a lot of commercial activity. These zones would provide a place for people to pull over quickly to pick up an order at a business or drop something off in their non-commercial vehicle cars, rather than double parking in the street. Small business owners could also use these zones to unload goods from their vehicles, which is currently, if they use their personal vehicle for business, and that currently is prohibited. They're prohibited from using yellow loading zones without commercial plates. And during the pandemic, there have been temporary versions of these zones as part of the shared spaces program, and the mayor recently announced legislation to make the shared spaces program permanent. So businesses in the future would be able to apply for a permit to have a curbside lane if that would benefit them and the street. And so that is the second idea that we are exploring as part of the solution set related to key commercial corridors. And now we'll get to this next audience poll about these two ideas, really trying to understand what types of connections are most important to you for a community shuttle and when that service might be useful to you. And also about how likely you would be to use a curbside loading zone if you drive to get out of the way of transit and vehicles and support safer commercial districts in District 4. And while you're taking that poll, Hugh, can we get an update on some comments and questions we're receiving on this or previous solutions that have been discussed?
Sure, absolutely. And again, thank you all for continuing to put your questions into the chat here. I should note also, I know some folks are on the phone and potentially maybe watching this via the live stream. And if you are, certainly visit our website, which is sfcta.org/D4mobility, if you want to be able to provide feedback to us, and we will respond to the requests that we get as best we can. There's looking back through the chat a little bit, there's some questions about thinking about like the context for how many people visit Ocean Beach in particular, and whether or not we've had the opportunity to look at, or if there are data in fact on Ocean Beach number of Ocean Beach visitors over time, pre-pandemic and pre-closure, to see if that helps us understand at least maybe how many people were visiting before the closure. I don't know, Brian, that's something that you're aware of or something we could look into.
Yeah, we have asked that question to the National Park Service. They would be best for the answer, but my recollection is they don't have specific numbers. But moving forward, I think there is a chance that we could find out there are some tools out there that we could try to find out how many people are actually going to the beach versus the promenade in the current situation, or in the past, the roadway. But I think that's a great question because that's a key element in the whole area. So I will follow up on that to see if they have any actual data and what we might be able to do to get some data.
Great. Yeah, I think that sounds really useful. There's really a couple interesting questions about how we're thinking about equity as it relates to, in particular, I think the Great Highway issue, but certainly something that we want to be thinking about more generally, and thinking about, who owns homes and who's likely to be driving, and how that impacts how people use the road. So I don't know if we have some thoughts, Camille, about how we're thinking about equity within this overall analysis approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that one of the ways we've been thinking about it is equitable access to park space, and I think adding more park space helps improve that equitable access to recreation and the benefits of health and well-being that go with that. So that's one way we're thinking about it. We're also thinking about how the roadway can, as a promenade, could provide access to people with disabilities to access open space, and kind of being a paved roadway. It's different than a lot of other parks that are not necessarily flat or might have different other access issues. And so that is something that we see as an equity benefit for people with disabilities to the to the promenade concepts. And I don't know if Brian and Tim, you want to add to some other thinking we've been doing in that regard.
I'll just add that I think the equity component is really key, and that I would just reiterate what you said, Camille, that this is a space for everyone, whatever its format, and that we want to make sure that everybody can get there.
Thanks. There were a couple of questions about the shuttle, and actually sort of pivoting, I think, off of what you were just saying, Camille, asking about, if we were considering shuttles, would they be accessible, as a way to help individuals with disabilities to travel around to, commercial districts within the Sunset, as a key question, but also a question about whether or not a shuttle would be more or less cost effective than a Muni bus that might provide the same service.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are good questions, and thankfully we have the efforts by our colleagues that have done explored shuttle concepts in other neighborhoods. And for example, in the I know that for the Treasure Island shuttle, they're considering that service would be accessible with like the available kind of ramp for the shuttle, and I think it could be special requests if it is an on-demand service. And then the other piece was that, there was, for the Treasure Island work, they did look at whether it could be served by transit versus a shuttle. And I think that the costs were fairly comparable in that sense, depending on the type of service that was provided. And so that's something we definitely want to analyze more, in particular for what that would look like for the District 4.
Great. I do just want to flag, because we are getting continued quite a few questions about what the sort of transit reopening are, and there's some frustration out there in the chat about not having those exact piece of information to hand, and we understand that that's a huge issue right now. And so there are a lot of detailed information, as I mentioned. I just want to ask Tim to maybe either say a quick statement about that, or if you can share via the chat maybe links to some of the places on the SFMTA website where there is some of that information for folks, since that actually isn't the focus of this particular workshop, but is something that we know is really important to folks in the city.
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. And we definitely, as I mentioned earlier, recognize that, it is really important, and it is definitely a priority for us at MTA to be bringing back our transit service. And so why don't I try to find some information that I can share so that I'm giving everyone here the latest information. And I can either send that out via notes from this meeting, or I can send it in a chat. But yeah, I definitely want to make sure I point people in the right direction to our transit recovery and reopening work. That's definitely, I can commit to doing that.
Great, thanks, Tim. Appreciate that.
Any other maybe one last comment or question, Hugh?
I think let's move along. I'm not seeing anything that sticks out right now.
Great. Thank you for reviewing the questions. The next solution set that we'll go over is a District 4 family neighborway network. And this idea has been identified as a priority for the District 4 office. Supervisor Marr has identified funding for this project to begin the design phase later this year, after we develop the network as part of the mobility study. And so this is a key priority for the district office, and has the opportunity to advance very quickly. And so I think getting to that question of how soon some of these ideas may come. This is one of the ones that we already know we want to and are able to advance quickly. And so neighborways are residential streets designed to give priority for people, young and old, to walk, bike, and play. Neighborways make streets feel quiet, safe, and inviting, with street design measures tailored to each neighborhood. And there are a number of street design strategies that can be applied to the corridors to make them have this quiet, safe, and inviting feel. And as mentioned, with the design phase happening after the mobility study, when we identify streets for further design, we'll get, the SFMTA will get into like the details of what designs go with which streets. But I did want to introduce the ones that may be potentially applied to neighborways in the Sunset, those streets that will be selected for further study. And not every design measure will apply to every street. And so it's really about kind of figuring out what's appropriate for the streets that advance. So these first couple are really about helping vehicles slow down when traveling on neighborway streets. I think most people are familiar with speed humps, and they encourage slower vehicle traffic. There's different variations of these. They could be speed tables, or on the right we see kind of a raised crosswalk where at places where there are pedestrian crossings, there is a raised platform so that there's increased visibility and slowing of vehicles. These next couple are about designating space and identifying sharing of space with bicyclists. And so these are bike lanes and sharrows, and the specific application of these would depend on the geometry and characteristics of the streets that are advancing. And in some cases, streets that we are considering for the neighborway network already have existing bike infrastructure. And so those already exist, and it would be adding other treatments to make it more of a neighborway. And last set of potential treatments are about strategies to reduce conflict with vehicles on these neighborway streets. And so traffic diverters, such as the one shown on the left, limit vehicle traffic on a street. And so that's a way to make a street safer. And then on the right, we see turn restrictions, which can reduce potential conflicts and improving safety for both pedestrians and bicyclists of those vehicles that are turning left. And so the SFMTA Livable Streets folks who we've partnered on this solution with looked at a number of criteria for neighborways. You know, the residential, they have to be residential streets within the jurisdiction of SFMTA, not on a existing muni route, because just trying to prevent that conflict from happening, and not on kind of an emergency corridor or on streets that operate as one way. And so there's also characteristics that are desirable for a neighborway, such as making connections to existing bikeways and connections to public space and parks. They should be streets that are relatively flat, and few intersections with traffic signals along the corridor, and as much as possible trying to be a continuous linear route of at least 4 to 6 blocks. And then being a family neighborway network, we've included on this map schools that are in the district and wanting to facilitate those connections. And so the network that we are considering is planned for 4 routes by 5 routes, including 20th Avenue, which has already been designated as a neighborway. So this is 4 east-west routes with 5 north-south routes. And so the east-west streets being considered are either Kirkham or Lawton. more in the middle of the districts, there's the option of Ortega. And then the third set would be either Quintara or Rivera. And last, Ulloa or Vicente for the east-west streets. For north-south streets, we are looking at 47th and 48th on the far west of the district. 41st more in the middle of the western part of the district. And then 37th, 36th, or 34th in the middle of the district. And 29th and 28th more towards the east. And as a reminder, 20th is already a neighborway and would be part of the network. Finally, separate from the District 4 mobility study, we wanted to flag that Bay Wheels bike share, the Bay Area bike share, is expanding to the Sunset and have been working to identify 7 to 10 stations to expand to in the Sunset. And their initial expansion of the sites that they are considering are more focused on the middle and northern end of the Sunset, really making those connections, existing connections, from the routes coming from downtown where there are existing stations and access to those bicycles. And so wanting to share those potential locations in relation to the neighborway network we're considering. And Neil Patel at Bay Wheels is the contact if you're interested in giving feedback on that process. And his email is at the bottom right here. And now we'll get into our next question and comment and poll segment, just really trying to understand what types of connections and destinations are most important to you for the family neighborway network. And as you're taking that poll, Hugh, if you could share any other comments and questions we've received.
Sure, absolutely. And thanks everyone for continuing to provide great questions and comments to us. One thing I just want to acknowledge, because there's been a handful of questions, more questions about the data and information, Camille, that you shared. I just want to acknowledge for folks that, there are a lot of concerns around, when we have data collected to support the study, and we've been trying to be really transparent about what data we have. There are not pre-COVID data for a lot of the things that we're able to collect during COVID, and we recognize that as a kind of significant limitation, and definitely that limitation has informed some of the ideas and thoughts that we have about, what needs to happen next. So I just want to make sure I acknowledge that. There are a couple questions related to whether or not there's been thoughts about providing parking for individuals who are coming to visit either Ocean Beach or a closed to cars Upper Great Highway. Let me just ask that question.
Yeah, I think that is a good question. We know that MTA, if Tim, you could speak to kind of some of the parking surveying you've been doing on the temporary promenade. And although we haven't explored this, I think there are opportunities for parking depending on which concept. So for example, the full closure concept and with the closure of the Great Highway extension would, have opportunities for maybe parking on the slope end of the Great Highway if that idea advances. So Tim, if you want to speak to how MTA has been thinking about parking in the area and monitoring that.
Yeah, thanks, Camille. Yeah, we did a parking assessment in January of this year and wanted to understand sort of existing parking supply as well as some of the demand that we were seeing. And obviously we did it earlier this year, and some of our initial findings from that assessment were that we didn't need to actively change any parking management at the time. However, I think as we go forward, that as I alluded to in my earlier comments, that's definitely something we wanted to be monitoring and looking at directly and collecting additional data. I will add that there is quite a bit of existing public and free parking just north of here near the Beach Chalet. There is a large public lot there. There's also Slope Boulevard has public parking, and there's quite a bit of public parking along streets such as Lincoln, which terminates in the Great Highway. But it's definitely something we want to keep looking at, and looking at some of the possible parking management strategies that we could possibly employ to make sure that there is public access to the promenade and to the parks and to this open space area. So it's definitely something we're going to continue to be looking at closely. But I do want to make sure that everyone's aware there is quite a bit of existing free public parking, and as part of the SFPUC's climate change project, there is plans to build new public parking down at the intersection of Skyline and Great Highway, which will improve access to the southern part of this stretch and also to Fort Funston and Lake Merced.
Great, thanks, Tim. There are a couple kind of maybe turning to the bike specific questions, biking and walking specific questions that we're looking at right now. Some questions about about that. So just to ask a couple of these. So one question, there are a couple of questions about 41st Avenue and what the kind of plan specifically is for 41st Avenue, and maybe just to kind of clarify, I know you kind of went over this, Camille, but clarify for folks what it means, what a slow street is, and what the intent is for 41st Avenue and potentially for some of these other investments that we're talking about.
Yeah, so I think I mentioned earlier that like at this phase, we are not talking specifics about what design treatments would go on the neighborway streets. Right now, we're trying to identify what a potential holistic network would look like that combines a lot of the design treatments I mentioned. And so, yeah, I think that is where, we worked with MTA to identify these potential neighborway streets, and they included a lot of the existing slow streets that have occurred in the pandemic, and just trying to understand what that network holistically looks like. And the design phase, as mentioned, that will start hopefully later this year after the study is done, we'll get into kind of more of what specific treatments, if 41st Avenue is one of the corridors we are advancing for the neighborway network, what specific treatments would go into that, and MTA would be leading that process of design.
Yeah, thanks, Camille. And maybe just to emphasize a point there, which is that, the notion of these slow streets is that they're not closed to vehicles. It's the idea is that people driving are the guests on the street, and they're meant to prioritize people walking and biking on the street. So mostly local access for vehicles, and then prioritize people walking and biking. There is a specific question about 41st Avenue that folks note is that, that's the street that is directly across from Chain of Lakes. And as you've acknowledged, with the Great Highway closed in particular, but I think more generally this is true as well. People use Chain of Lakes as a pass through from the Richmond to the Sunset. And so there's kind of a question, that's something to think about whether or not that's the right location for a slow street, since it, directly lines up with a street that's currently used primarily by vehicles.
Great. Yeah, that's a great comment. I think that, there's synergy that happens among all the different ideas that are related in the mobility study. And so if when we know more of what Great Highway concept is advancing based on, the decisions by the Rec and Park Department and MTA, then we can also have a better idea of if the 41st Avenue neighborway makes sense in relation to whichever concept Great Highway concept is evaluating. And I think that's one of the benefits of the mobility study, is trying to look at these related connections and make improvements that complement each other.
There are a handful of questions that relate to the treatments, and then you know, but in particular relate to whether or not enforcement is being considered for the slow streets, and sort of noting that if we're going to have these slow streets, you know, how do you make sure that the drivers who are using it are, you know, respecting the intended much lower speeds of those streets? And I don't know, Camille or Tim, if you want to speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, that's something that I think we haven't got into as part of the neighborway conception, but I have heard related to the Slow Streets program. And we do also have Corinne Patel from SFMTA, who is also familiar with that program and can speak to kind of what they've heard about enforcement for the Slow Streets program. Corinne, are you available to speak to that?
Hi, yeah. I don't actually know too much about enforcement. I do know that a lot of these slow streets have come together as a community and like put out barricades, some signs to say slow down, but I haven't heard too much about overall enforcement.
All right, yeah, so I think that's a question that we will have to get back to folks on. But I think with the slow streets, these are more, you know, kind of temporary installments, and with the neighborway network, the design treatments would be permanent treatments, and I think the hope is that those treatments would lend to more compliance with you know, the vehicles slowing down in these designated areas.
And then there are also some questions related to coordination, and we touched on this a little bit before, but kind of coordination with safe routes to school and some of these concepts that we're talking about. So maybe you just want to speak a little bit about that. And then in particular, I think about not just the kind of coordination, but also the need for increased education for folks, especially with these kind of new ideas and new treatments coming forward, and helping folks understand, you know, what the expectation is for how they're used, and how to safely, especially for kids, you know, be walking and biking through these new kind of ideas.
Yeah, that's great feedback. I think that's more, yeah, that's something we can do as we advance the idea forward and really figure out what streets are advancing as part of the network. I think just, I think thinking about the schools, that has always been a key aspect of the concept and strategy. And so, yeah, it would be great to connect to some of the network of parents and coordinators to get their feedback about the potential neighborway network streets. Okay, should we move on to our last solution set, unless there's one more quick question you want to
let's move
report
on.
back? Great, thanks you. And so last we have our final solution set, which is looking at safety improvements to Lincoln Way. And so, you know, in our outreach, Lincoln was flagged as one of the locations that people have experienced pedestrian issues at. And in 2018, the planning department looked at existing conditions around the edges of Golden Gate Park, and one of the key findings that they found, and as part of that quick study, was that there was limited pedestrian design features and infrastructure around the park, including Fulton and Lincoln Way. And so we also know that Lincoln Way, east of 22nd Avenue, is part of the high injury network. This is the network of streets in the city where there are high occurrences of vehicle collisions with pedestrians and bicyclists. And in looking at the data from 2006 to 2017, there were 51 pedestrian involved collisions on Lincoln between Great Highway and Arguello. with 36 of those being on the western end in District 4. And so there's a number of different safety improvements that could be applied to Lincoln, and some of these already have in some places, but the first being daylighting. This is something that the supervisor's office has been working closely with MTA to implement kind of district-wide. And I think it's through this study, we'd be making sure that to identify any remaining streets on Lincoln or any remaining intersections on Lincoln that still need this type of safety strategy. And with daylighting, it's not only safer for visibility for pedestrians, but it also helps drivers see even cross traffic better as they are making turns or are trying to enter a street. And then similar to the right, we see the painted safety zones, and these have been implemented in various parts of the city where it does, like daylighting, provide more visibility and also allows for vehicles to make wider turns to really help prevent those kind of tight turns that might happen and pedestrian and vehicle collisions. Next, there's different street designs, such as advanced limit lines that are painted lines before crosswalks to signal where drivers could stop and prevent them from encroaching on the crosswalk. And we've seen in other parts of the city, road diets happen on streets to make them more safer. And a road diet is a traffic safety design measure where 4 lanes are converted to 3 with a center turn lane. And shown here is a local example at 25th Avenue in the Richmond, which has seen about a 20% reduction in collisions. So that might be considered for maybe the less busy parts of Lincoln Way. And getting back to the early point about depending on which concept advances forward with the Great Highway, then we consider different options on Lincoln as well. And so with that, we don't have a poll for this solution set, but if you want to share some comments about maybe some intersections along Lincoln Way where you experience pedestrian or other safety issues, we welcome to hear about that. And we can also go back and answer questions about other parts of the study that we've covered so far.
Great. So what folks are thinking about the Lincoln questions and providing any kind of questions about that, just sort of flipping back through. And again, there are lots and lots of questions here. We really appreciate all of your efforts and contributions here. There are a number of questions sort of going all the way back to the beginning related to thinking about the citywide impact of the Great Highway closure, and also asking, what we are doing to try to understand what things might look like in the future, when the economy reopens. And so, Camille, maybe you want to speak a little bit about some of the analysis, a little bit more about some of the sort of future-looking analysis that we've done as part of our work there.
Yeah, so I think I showed kind of the monitoring that we're doing of the congestion and how it, or whether it's returning to pre-COVID levels. So again, that's like one tool that we have on hand to know what's happening and where there might be issues as the temporary closure continues. So that's one key piece. I think another piece is that we do have we have colleagues at the Transportation Authority that have modeled kind of what traffic might look like at different phases of recovery and what those volumes would look like on our entire city network. And so we have access to kind of those scenarios and could model kind of what those Great Highway changes might be under different scenarios, if that is relevant, or if we're honing in on a concept, really trying to understand what that impact is under scenario. So that's an opportunity if we need to do that and really understand the concepts in that context of where the city patterns are at certain points of our recovery from the pandemic. Did that cover most of what those comments were about, Hugh?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I just emphasize, we are doing modeling that we do at the Transportation Authority to try to project forward, recognizing that, like everything, as we emerge from the pandemic, we don't know exactly what the future is going to look like, and we anticipate it'll be somewhat different, and that's why monitoring is such an important part of what we do. There are, kind of getting to the Lincoln related questions, there's some interesting thoughts. So there's a comment or a note, I guess, maybe something for Brian to speak to about the face of the park, so where people kind of come out of the park, there's, there aren't sidewalks, and there are a lot of people kind of moving out of the park at different locations and, trying to get into cars or trying to cross the street, and whether or not there's anything that could be done on the kind of park face to help address some of those potential challenges.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think the key with that, and I've observed, just so everybody knows, as many people probably do know, on the Fulton face, there is a sidewalk along the park. However, on the majority of the Lincoln side, there is not a sidewalk. I think the key, what I've observed, is there are not a significant, this is only my anecdotal observation, but a study could help this, is there are not that many people walking along the roadway next to the park. Most of them are actually going into the park, and whether walking along the horse trails and paths along those two streets. You're within the trees then. But I think the key thing is about how can we make crossing the roadway more safe? And as many of the bus stops have a little sidewalk zone, and I think that's where addressing that crossing is the safety thing. The one challenge with, if we were to put in a sidewalk, is if you put it within the parkland, there would be a significant change into you'd have a lot of vegetation have to be removed, and there would be a large expense. If there was deemed really important, that could be pursued. But I think the key is crossing the streets and making that a better experience and safer for everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Some interesting thoughts from folks about, in terms of sort of prioritizing the crossings, looking at where there are bus stops as places potentially to prioritize. Quite a few comments from folks about specific locations, and that's really useful. We appreciate that.
Thank
and we'll
you.
incorporate that those ideas into our thinking. There are quite a few thoughts all the way up and down Lincoln, which we will share. I mean, we are focused in this study on District 4, which ends at 19th. So we will make sure that those comments that are outside certainly get passed along to MTA so that they have those comments from us. And there are quite a few other ideas in here about kind of, as I say, very specific improvements that we will certainly make sure we capture in the overall study. And then, let's see, shoot, I lost one that I was going to ask. I'll come back to it.
Yeah.
Keep going.
So yeah, please keep sending the feedback about maybe specific issue problem areas on Lincoln. That is helpful to us as we figure out how to advance that solution set. And so while he was looking at more questions, I'll get into what's next for the study. We're continuing outreach on these developing solutions. We will be posting this information on our website and next week. And so by the end of next week, you'll be able to see you'll see, actually immediately after the meeting, you'll see this. You'll be able to see this slide deck, but we'll have actually a formal website page with all of the ideas where you can continue to provide feedback, and we'll also be reaching out to different groups to get more specific feedback as well, and really trying to refine these ideas for the final report that we are preparing to be completed in June. And so that concludes my formal presentation. And if you identified other questions and comments, we can continue to take those. And otherwise, there's nothing else on the formal presentation for now.
Yeah, I just want to maybe quickly reemphasize for folks that, like, we recognize, and I know there's quite a lot of very strong feelings about the Great Highway closure, both for and folks who don't approve of it and feel very strongly in both directions. And we are capturing all of the stuff in the chat and all the other feedback that we get throughout this work, by any means. Just to be clear, in terms of the kind of recommendations, Camille, that you spoke to from our study, is a recognition that we don't feel like we have all the data and information coming out of our study to make a simple, clear statement about what the appropriate next steps are. We think there are concepts like concept 2 that we feel strongly could be ruled out based on the kind of relationship between benefits and cost of those, but that we want to sort of pass those on, and that the process for that, is intended to go as you and Brian described, to both the Rec Park Department and MTA, and they're looking to do this kind of combined, follow-on work from it, and then ultimately the Board of Supervisors will play a role in making a decision about that. And really our job here at the Transportation Authority is to try to provide the best kind of information and data that we can, as well as the best information we can gather from you all. And so we really appreciate you all kind of participating in this effort.
Yes, thank you, Hugh, for reiterating that. We tried our best to evaluate kind of at a high level what the impacts were of each of the concepts, and giving that to the decision makers is our next step to figure out what the future of the Great Highway will be.
Yeah, and this is Brian. I just want to reiterate, we do have the email rec-greathighway@sfgov.org. Please send your comments and your questions there. And as Hugh mentioned, we'll be taking this to a joint hearing with the Rec and Park Commission and the MTA board sometime this late spring or early summer, and we will definitely inform everybody through many different channels of that hearing.
Yes, and we'll include in our communications about the District 4 mobility study. And so if you are on our mailing list for the study, we'll be communicating those next steps as well. I just want to finish by thanking everyone for attending and spending your Saturday morning with us, and for your great participation and continued participation in the study. And I'll pass it back to Edward to make some concluding remarks.
Thank you so much, Camille. Thank you so much, Hugh and Brian and Tim, both for all the information you presented today and also all the work you've put into this study. I just want to emphasize again on behalf of Supervisor Marr that we really do want everyone's input as any of these concepts move forward. The concepts coming out of this study are just that. They're concepts. They've been identified as potential new solutions, potential programs to improve access to transportation and mobility for the Sunset and the West Side. For any of these to then move forward, they would each be their own project. They would each have additional outreach, additional public input opportunities, and that includes, as folks just spoke to, the process moving forward for the Great Highway. We also recognize that a lot of the changes that have happened to our streets in the last year have happened really quickly and have happened really without that kind of level of public engagement or public input. As MTA and city departments across San Francisco tried to work quickly to adapt to the pandemic and all the unprecedented challenges that it's brought forward. And we're thrilled that San Francisco is now in the orange tier. We hope to continue to reopen more. And with that, we are kind of approaching a transitional phase. And that goes for the temporary street changes that were made, and how we all collectively want to decide to move forward and make sure our streets are meeting the needs of everyone. So that is our approach, and we look forward to the continued input from the public throughout the month of April for the mobility study, and then the additional input opportunities that'll be available beyond then, particularly for the Great Highway at that the publicly available meetings for the Record Park Commission and for the NTA board as well. And if you have any questions for our office, you're also welcome to email us at marstaff@sfgov.org. You can also email me directly at staff on all these different transportation issues at edward.w.wright@sfgov.org. And thanks once again, everyone, for spending some time on a Saturday with us to hear all this analysis and these new concepts. We will make this recording available of this presentation and share that out along with the input opportunities going forward. And thanks again, Camille and Hugh and everyone at the TA and MTA and Record Park. And I hope everyone has a great weekend. And that concludes our meeting. Thank you.